human design in the gene key realm in 2027, we are changing our 4 main gene keys as a species. So just like we have our main 4 as a collective, those are going to be changing in February of 2027. Why is this significant? Because we have not gone through an incarnation cross or a main 4 gene key switch as a collective since 1615. So nobody has been alive since we had changed incarnation crosses, and the one we're in now is called the Cross of Planning, and in 2027 we will be going into the Cross of the Sleeping Phoenix.
Which is very interesting.
Very interesting. We didn't realize till recently, till me and Aurora started talking about it more and actually looking up articles, and I did see something about the incarnation cross changing and that it hadn't happened since 1615. Me and her were like, oh shit, like this is bigger than Pluto going into Aquarius kind of energy. You know what I mean? Like it's a big shift.
And that was like one interesting thing where, because I've been like, you know, looking at like the archetypes of all the planets and the signs, and they're going through their own evolution, right? And they're kind of changing their archetypes to let go of the lower ones. And so I was like giving, in the podcast that I've done, I was giving the example of like, you know, every time you discover a new planet, you're basically ready to integrate that consciousness collectively, right? So when we were talking about the last time it shifts being 1615, what's interesting is like for all of basically, well, we don't know. We've been through periods where we became advanced. Maybe they reset us, whatever. To our knowledge, mostly the sun and the moon was what people saw. So those were the only archetypes for like a long time at the primitive species. Mercury, their first documentation of it was somewhere around 3000 BC, but it wasn't like officially recognized as a planet and like able to be tracked until like later than that. So I think closer to like, you know, maybe like the 1200s or 1300s or something, right? And Mercury is communication, language, writing. So it's interesting. It was first noted in some documents in 3000 BC by the Sumerians, and that's when language had a burst. Interesting. And they started having like hieroglyphics and like writing and written language and all that stuff. When it was officially recognized, probably I guess 12 or 1300, that's when of course there's probably a boom in literature, all this stuff, right? But other than that, those were the only 3 planets. Like if we can go back 20-something thousand years, that's all we really had track of. The weirdest thing is that in 1610, so 5 years before we entered a whole new incarnation cross, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were all discovered in the same year, 1610.
Right before we changed.
Right before we changed. So it was a whole new epoch of archetypes of consciousness that came fucking in.
Right at the tail end. Like, literally that would be like us discovering like 5 new planets like in this year.
Might
like right
happen.
Before, it's true. I mean, they have discovered, I mean, I know it's been like a decade. The dwarf ones, the asteroids outside of Pluto, they're constantly discovering some.
Kuiper belt or whatever.
Yeah, the Kuiper belts, like that's been big, and like I know that they've discovered like Sedna, Eris, Haumea. Those have been some big ones over the last like couple decades.
I've seen some interesting articles the last few days of like they're discovering all these planets that are really far away, but they're picking up like, you know, emissions, radio signals, however the fuck they say they do it. But I'm like, that would be so interesting if all of a sudden we discovered like,
oh, you mean, 534 planets in the solar system that Mom got roasted on an interview for how many planets are in the solar system? Mom's like, 534. And they're like, oh, it's actually 7. And it's like, well, if you look at, like, everything that they're talking about now and people that do astrology and stuff. Right, like, surprise, like, people do honor...
you don't fucking know shit.
Right. But it's like, a lot of astrologers are getting into asteroids now because they realize they're significant. Human design folks are getting into asteroids because they know they're significant. And that's something that Ra-Uru, who got, like, when he channeled it, I'm pretty sure it was the voice specifically that told him, and because he left he ascended in 2011. So he hasn't been here for, over a decade now, but his work carries on, and I feel he did tell his students and, like, people when he was giving seminars that, like, the work isn't done. Like, what he was given will continue to expand, and hence why you have somebody like Richard Rudd who has gone into more depth And I feel like that book was published like in 2012, I want to say. It was right around that time. So right around the time Ra left the planet, Richard Rudd kind of came into the scene with the Gene Keys and continued his work. And there's other people that we follow, like I said, astrologers that are getting into asteroids now, human design people and Gene Key people that are getting into the asteroids, and why it's significant because, you know, it wasn't an end-all, be-all. Same thing that Aurora says all the time with astrology. Like, it's always changing. We're going to be finding new things. There's going to be new ways. Astrology will, and just like everything, human design, Gene Keys, everything at some point will probably be rewritten in the future as we expand our consciousness, but this is what we're working with now.
Yeah, but it makes sense if, like, we're, you know, any time before, I feel like the years leading up to some major cosmic cycle or shift, that is a transition. So my feeling is like we're in that transition, because by the time we get to 2027, that's when it's like it's solidified.
Yeah.
So it's like what we're going through, I guess, now is like is that transition
It
process.
is. It was like what that woman, she did a TikTok on this, and this kind of gave like us the right perspective of like what this means, and she explained it as a radio frequency. So if you're in the United States or something, this would probably be more like palpable versus like if you're in a different, like in Europe and something or something like that. But in like America, when you are driving through a state, you get their local radio stations. And then when you leave the state, those radio frequencies start to tune out because you're going into a new state that has its own local radio stations. So she's saying that like we have been vibrating on the cross of planning since 1615. So we are on that radio frequency. That is what has built our society for the last 400 years, is this frequency. So as we have gone closer to 2027, and we've been feeling this probably since the 2000s, as we've gotten closer to this than 1615, we are feeling more of that radio frequency. We can already feel what's coming in 2027. We know about timelines. We know we can feel everything. So we are starting to hear the new radio station that we're tuning into, and we can also hear the old. Again, this is why the chaos, the things that are happening on the planet, it is aligning to things that are written in the stars, ironically enough. So it's like we are hearing the old, it's getting fuzzy as we're tuning it out, and then it's kind of fuzzy on the 2027 side where we're not there yet, so we don't have that full frequency. So we're kind of in between the frequencies of the radio stations, which is why, again, there's so much chaos, because we're confused. Our consciousness is like we're